Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, Professor.
Good afternoon.
Okay, are there any questions before we start?
Did you have a heart attack reading any of our exams?
Well, to be honest with you, I haven't even seen them yet.
Oh,
I've been so busy that I really haven't had a chance to look at the questions, but hopefully, I will start looking at them this weekend because, I have a lot of other exams that I need to prepare and papers that I need to grade. So I was very, very busy all this week, but hopefully, I will have a chance to look at them on Saturday, I guess. I won't be able to do it even tomorrow because I'm still going to be very busy tomorrow. But Saturday, hopefully, I should start going over the questions. Okay. Yeah. Anyone else has a question? Okay, today what we want to do is we want to start on chapter 5. Chapter 5 is an interesting chapter. Basically, it deals with human capital. And when we talk about human capital, we have two things in mind. We're actually interested in looking at health and education. And those two are pretty much considered to be the pillars of economic development, health and education. In other words, in order for a country to develop and advance, that country has to have a well-educated labor force and also a healthy labor force. So those two things go hand in hand when it comes to development trajectories. So obviously today what we will do is we will go over this human capital phenomenon and see how the MENA region has done in as far as developing human capital. And you will see that for the MENA region, the development of human capital was pretty much a policy priority. And the reason why it was a policy priority, simply because, as I said, those are considered to be the two pillars of development trajectories on all aspects, economic, social, political. So those are extremely important elements that go into the development equation. But more important than that for the MENA region, the reason why they made it a policy priority is because, with the exception of oil, the MENA region, basically, they don't have that many resources. In other words, the only resource that they have is pretty much oil. Other than that, I mean, they're so meager in other resources. So the best thing for them, obviously, is to try and develop, their human resources, which is extremely important. And as we have seen already, that factor has not been very well developed. And there has not been any consistent planning and policies that go into enhancing the human development project in the MENA region. As we saw with the labor force participation rates for male and female, it was extremely low as compared with other countries. So that's something that the MENA region, they really have to work very hard in trying to put this on the right track. in terms of helping to or exploiting or taking advantage of the human resource factor that they have. But so far in the MENA region, for the most part, it really is a wasted resource. And the reason, as I said, is simply because of inadequate planning and inadequate policy formulations and the lack of a pretty much consistent vision, if you will, in the leadership that would probably, as I said, put these two factors on the right track. So today, basically, that's what we want to do. We want to look at the human development process. How successful have the countries in the MENA region been in as far as putting this on the right track? Now, before I do that, I just want to very quickly look at some of the things that are pretty much related with human development in the MENA region. Like, for example, we want to look at it from the point of view of available resources, because obviously you need huge resources to be able to develop this. Education and health, they're not cheap. They're very, very expensive. And they happen to absorb a lot of the country's funds. So we really want to look at the different strategies undertaken by these countries to try and eliminate waste, but we see that they really have not been very, very successful, and we will see why. But first things first, and that is, like all governments in the world, the governments in the MENA region are no exception, meaning that these governments have so many responsibilities in terms of providing universal high quality education, controlling and eradicating infectious diseases, reducing discrimination against women, providing safe drinking water, and other sanitation services, controlling air pollution. So you can see, I mean, the responsibilities on the shoulders of these governments is not a joke. They have a lot of responsibilities. Again, controlling air pollution, as I said, disposing of waste, municipal waste, and also building what we call the proper urban infrastructure. Now, when we talk about urban infrastructure here, what are we actually talking about? Does anyone have an idea here of what urban infrastructure is?
Indoor plumbing, electricity,
Very good.
internet, roads.
Absolutely. In other words, we're pretty much talking about piped in water, sewer lines, um, gas lines, paved roads, mass transit, electricity. All of this is basically part of the urban infrastructure. And as we all know, these things cost a lot of money to build. So the investment in infrastructure is extremely expensive. And countries obviously have to make sure that the right amount of money is allocated towards investment in infrastructure. as well as, of course, education and health, like we said. So those are basically some of the things that governments really have to worry about. Now, the challenge is obviously in finding adequate sources of funds and the right qualified personnel to staff all of these bureaucracies. Basically, um, is not an easy thing to do. Um, in other words, the government also has another thing on their hands as a result of all of this, creating huge bureaucracies and finding the right personnel to staff these bureaucracies. Another problem that arises, can anyone think of a problem that would arise out of all of this?
Associates of government officials will be the one doing the infrastructure building.
Yeah, but what sort of problem will be created as a result of all of this?
Bad quality infrastructure.
Yeah, but a little bit more direct than that. Corruption. And here comes the challenge that a lot of these governments have in trying to control corruption. And the best way, of course, to control corruption is simply by paying civil servants a little bit more than they actually pay them. This would obviously reduce the incentives to steal. And another thing that these governments end up doing, of course, also is an added expense again in promoting what we call the auditing and monitoring systems. So then again, all of this is an added expense for these countries. And obviously, when we talk about corruption here, I mean, the way we define corruption is simply the abuse of the entrusted power that these bureaucrats are given. In other words, they obviously have certain powers. They attain certain powers in certain positions, and they are entrusted with this public trust, if you will. However, they use this public trust for private gain. And that's basically what we mean by corruption. And unfortunately, the rate of corruption is extremely high in a lot of these countries, as you have seen from the presentations that you did regarding the CPI, the Corruption Perception Index for a lot of these countries. Remember we looked at the CPI and we said that it has a score from 0 to 100, where 0 simply refers to most corrupt states, and 100, of course, is least corrupt. And the MENA region happens to be somewhere in the middle. Obviously, they are very diverse, so you would see some of them are in the 60s, some are in the 70s, and so on. But the level of corruption is obviously present, and it's creating a lot of challenges for governments, basically, in providing the right public services, proper public services, etc. The policies that will augment some of the achievements of the MENA region governments, obviously, because there are a lot of successes, there are a lot of achievements. Now, if governments use policies to augment these achievements and to mitigate some of the shortcomings that may arise as a result of implementing these policies, then we can say that, governments are obviously heading in the right direction. But if the policies that they implement don't happen to augment the achievements that have already been undertaken, and they do not present ways, if you will, to mitigate some of the shortcomings, then we say that these governments are obviously not heading in the right direction. So again, it also depends on the type of policies that are being implemented. What are these policies doing? Are they augmenting the achievements? And are they finding solutions to mitigate some of the shortcomings and to address some of the challenges? That's basically where we can see if policies have been successful or not. So we got to look at what these governments are doing also. Now, again, we will have a chance later on to talk about some of these policies, their failures and their successes. And we will probably also try to present some recommendations, some solutions for all the shortcomings and all the challenges that the MENA region countries have been facing so far when it comes to human development. Now, going back to human development, and the human development here, I guess the chapter is Human Capital, Health and Education. That's the title of your chapter, Human Capital, Health and Education. So, when we want to look at the extent, if you will, of how successful the MENA region has done when it comes to developing its human capital, the best way to do that, or to gauge it, or to measure it, or to assess it basically, is to look at the Human Development Index. Now, this is something that was developed by the UNDP, in other words, the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. The UNDP pretty much publishes a series of annual reports that are relegated to human development. And the centerpiece of this report is the Human Development Index. That is the centerpiece of the report that is published on a yearly basis by the UN. Now, the Human Development Index basically happens to rank all countries on a scale of 0 to 1 or 0 to 100, depending on the numbers that you're using. It really doesn't matter. You could use 0 to 1 or 0 to 100. It's going to give you the same results. And the Human Development Index is basically based on 3 goals of development. The number one is it tries to measure the longevity as measured by life expectancy at birth. So that's the first factor you see in the Human Development Index, is LEB, L-E-B, that we talked about last time, which is simply life expectancy at birth. In other words, how many years does a person have to live from the day that they were born, basically, or the average number of years that this person will survive. For rich industrialized countries, that's usually about, on the average, around 82, 81 And for poor countries, it's around about 50, 45, 49, somewhere around there. So, the longevity here is extremely important because really that tells us something about health conditions. Because the Human Development Index really looks at health, education, and per capita income. Those are the three categories that are used in assessing human development. We got to look at the educational level, we got to look at the health conditions, and we got to look at the standard of living as measured by per capita income. That's basically really the three most important elements that happen to define the Human Development Index. So longevity measured by the life expectancy at birth, and then we have education basically, which is measured by a weighted average of adult literacy. Now, usually adult literacy is given a weight of 2/3, and the mean years of schooling, which is given a weight of 1/3. So that's basically it tells us something about the educational level in that particular country. So we want to measure it by simply taking a weighted average, again, of adult literacy, which is measured in percentages here. So usually, it depends. Again, it's different from one country to another in the MENA region. Some countries happen to have a very high adult literacy rate, which is probably sometimes close to 90, 91, 92. Some may have a little bit lower, 80, 79, 85% of the adult population is literate, meaning they know how to write and read. That's basically what we mean by the literacy rate. So the adult literacy rate is used as one component. And then, of course, the mean years of schooling. Does anyone know what the mean years of schooling is, or what does it mean when we talk about the mean year of schooling?
The average year of student going to school.
Can you speak up?
I said it's the average of the typical person of going to school.
Yeah, to be exact, when we talk about because there is also the expected years of schooling. There is the expected years of schooling, and there is the average mean year of schooling, two different things. Now, let me first explain the first one. The average mean year of schooling, that's simply defined as the number of years of education attained by people who are 25 years and older. That's what we mean by the average number of years of education, or if you want to call it the average mean years of schooling. It simply looks at the average number of years of education attained by someone who is 25 years or older. How many years did they spend in school? Did they spend 6 years, 9 years, 12 years, 15 years, 18 years? How many years on the average someone who is above the age of 25 has spent? So that's basically known as the average mean years of schooling. Now, when we look at the expected years of schooling, this simply looks at the number of years of schooling that a child of school entering age can expect to receive throughout the child's life, basically. So that's, technical. The difference is very technical, highly technical, but that's basically, what the UN uses, the UNDP basically uses when it tries to measure the educational level in countries based on those two averages, the average mean years of schooling and also the expected years of schooling. Well, we don't want to get too much into the technicalities here, but I just thought that, I would make a distinction here and make sure that, that there is a difference between them. So when you read it somewhere, I don't know, in a journal or newspaper, or you hear some pundits talk about it, you know exactly what they're talking about here. Now, the weights that are given, again, with the UNDP when it comes to education, it's a weighted average of adult literacy that carries 2/3, a weight of 2/3, and then the mean years of schooling takes a weight of 1/3. That's basically how. Later on, I guess if we have some time, we will probably, I just give you an example of how we go about computing this thing. You will really not find this in any book, but I just thought that it would be a good idea to see how these things are actually computed. So we will look at it at the end. If we have some time, we will look at it. You're not supposed to know it for exam purposes, of course, but this is just for your general knowledge. That's why I'm going to leave it all the way to the end. So again, the three components in the Human Development Index, as we said, are first one looks at the health condition measured by the longevity, by looking at the life expectancy at birth. The other one, of course, looks at educational level, and that is measured again by adult literacy as well as by the mean years of schooling. And each one of those is given a different weight. And then the third one, of course, is the standard of living. And the standard of living here is simply measured by per capita income. And this per capita income is adjusted, by the way, we're talking about real per capita income, which is adjusted for inflation as well as adjusted for differences in triple P, purchasing power parity, because we want to have some sort of parity between different countries, and this would really give us a much better idea of what we have at hand. So usually when we compute per capita income, we do not compute it based on the current foreign exchange rate, but we compute it based on purchasing power parity. In other words, it's very possible that just an example here. One Egyptian pound may be equivalent to 10 cents. One Egyptian pound may be equivalent to 10 cents. That's the official exchange rate. But when we look at the purchasing power parity, we find that what you can buy for 10 cents in Egypt, is not equivalent to one Egyptian pound. But that 10 cents, if you take them to Egypt, can actually buy for you £5 worth of goods. So you see the difference here between looking at the official exchange rate and the purchasing power parity? Makes a huge difference, right? Does everyone see that?
Yeah.
Very good. So that's why usually, when we look at per capita income, we really don't compute per capita income based on the official foreign exchange rates, because really that will underestimate basically what people from less developed countries can actually spend with those dollars. Therefore, the best thing here is obviously to compute per capita income based on purchasing power parity. How much those dollars can actually buy for you in that particular country. Okay, so those are basically the three elements or the three components of the Human Development Index. So hopefully by now we know exactly what the Human Development Index is, we know who publishes it, and we know the time interval, which is 1 year. On a yearly basis, you see Human Development Indexes published for all countries. Obviously, the UN publishes that. And the World Bank, the IMF, they use these numbers quite extensively in their research and in their proposals, their recommendations, what have you. So the Human Development Index is extremely important as a source of information for basically, showing how countries are doing. Now, by combining obviously the social and economic data, the Human Development Index allows nations pretty much to take a much broader measure of their development performance. So that's the beauty of it. That's the essential part of the Human Development Index, is that it allows basically countries to use that Human Development Index number to, pretty much form an idea or form an opinion, if you will, on the development performance of that particular country. So that's very important. Now, just before we go into the, we're going to start first with the health component, and then we will explain exactly the issues surrounding the health conditions and how we measure that and how much has the different countries in the MENA region spent on the health of their societies in terms of hospitals, doctors, medicines, prevention. There's so many things that go into the system, and as far as the healthcare system is concerned, basically, the infrastructure of it all. So we will pretty much focus on that at first, and then we go to the educational part of it, and after that we will try to put those two together, and again together with per capita income. And we probably want to focus also, when we talk about per capita income, on income inequality and get some sort of an idea of how strong this income inequality is in the MENA region, and what are the causes of this income inequality, and also be able to measure income inequality. And in this case, we will probably use the Gini coefficient or the Gini index and the Lawrence curve. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Gini coefficient and the Lawrence curves from your principles of micro. And for those of you who have taken economic development, you probably dealt with that, or I don't know if you How many of you are taking intermediate macro? 320.
I took it last semester.
Did you deal with the Gini coefficient?
Tons.
Oh yeah, okay. So obviously you're pretty much familiar with it then. Yeah, the Gini coefficient is important. We will look at it. We will not go too deep into it. In other words, we're really not very much interested in the technicalities, but I will just, give you a good idea of what it is and how you go about measuring the Gini coefficient. And we'll try to interpret what the Gini coefficient is. So those are some of the things that we will do. But before we do that, just let's get some comprehensive view of where the MENA region stands in terms of human development. And we will see that, as I said previously, first of all, it is very important to note that the MENA region has made human development a policy priority. And I hope by now you know the reason why. Anyone? We just explained it why a few minutes ago. Anyone remembers why the MENA region made human development a policy priority?
Its human capital is not that high quality. And so in order to get the higher paying jobs, you need to have higher quality human capital.
Yeah, what are the other reasons? What are the reasons that I stressed at the beginning, if you remember? And I said why countries in the MENA region take this very seriously, and they actually made it a policy priority.
Does it have to do with the high chance of corruption and needing policies to be very clear to mitigate corruption and focus on the long run?
Yeah, but there is something else that's important. What did we say about human development? Or what is a human development here? When we talk about human development, what are we referring to?
Human development is a standard of living, some health conditions, and your education level.
So basically, in summary, we're talking about the health and education of the labor force. It boils down to that. You're really trying to invest in human capital by educating your labor force and by making sure that your labor force is healthy to perform jobs, correct? That's basically what it is. And we said that those are the two most important factors when it comes to what? To economic development, right? Those are the foundations. Those are the principles. Those are the pillars of development. So obviously in the MENA region, as well as in any other country, I don't care whether they're developed or less developed, their priority should always be on HD, human development. And I've also mentioned another thing about why this is a policy priority. If you remember, I said that the MENA region, the only resource that they have is oil. So they really need to develop other resources. And in their case, of course, they have very high population growth, so their labor force is pretty much well numbered. And as a result, in order to have a productive labor force, you need for that labor force to be well educated, and you want to make sure that the labor force that you have is very healthy. So that's basically the reason why countries in the MENA region happen to focus on human development. So again, as I said, the MENA has made human development a policy priority. Major governments in the MENA region have invested heavily in the social sectors and also in the public infrastructure. The MENA also enjoyed significant advances in social development and also have achieved, some, I don't want to say complete, but they have in fact achieved some tangible social mobility as a result of their investment in human capital. So they have made some strides. There were some successes in as far as the social mobility is concerned. So, somehow tangible. It was something that you can actually see. And also the MENA region countries were pretty much instrumental as well in establishing basic public welfare programs. This is another thing that the MENA region governments have sought to pay attention to, making sure that they would establish enough adequate basic public welfare programs. And all of this, obviously, the objective here and the goal, of course, is to use a lot of the establishment of these programs to create some sort of employment among the many people who are unemployed. Now, this human development investment was very rapid during the 60s and 70s. In other words, as a lot of these countries began to gain independence, a lot of these countries wanted to exploit the idea that now they are independent, now they are sovereign. So now they really are not willing to put their eggs in one basket, meaning having their former colonialists to participate in the development process. They simply wanted to have complete independence, complete sovereignty. So they said, okay, the best way to do it basically is to invest in our own human capital. And so during the 60s and 70s, you saw this huge increase in investment in government expenditure on human capital, education, health, etc. So the trend was pretty much upward, during the 60s, 70s. However, and there was basically a good reason why these governments exploited that opportunity to the max, for the simple reason because when you are starting afresh on this type of investments, the marginal cost of investing in these huge projects is extremely low because you're really starting from the base. Now, the marginal cost will start to increase tremendously at a later stage. And that's why you see that at the beginning, investment in human development, in human capital was very high, was very rapid. So the trend was really moving upward, basically. It was shooting up. But during the 80s and 90s, late 80s and early 90s, a lot of these countries saw a reverse in the trend. So things started to decline basically when it came to investing in human capital. And there are many reasons why, of course, that these countries.
The last decade?
What's that? Exactly. That's one reason, the last decade. And the other reason, of course, was that the government was taking the back seat to development. It was letting the private sector to share much of the burden. However, the private sector was small and weak and really was not able to pick up the slack. So that was a huge problem there. Those are two very important problems that led to a downward trend. But the other problem, which I did allude to earlier on, if you remember, when I talked about marginal cost starts very low. The marginal cost of investment in human capital starts very low when you're starting fresh from scratch. But then the marginal cost starts to catch up with you as you are in the later and further stages of human development. So when the marginal cost started to increase um, exorbitantly, a lot of these governments put the brakes on. And that's basically, you know, 3 or 4 reasons that I just alluded to here, which obviously caused the trend to show a downward movement, if you will. So those are some of the things that we really need to remember when we try to look at exactly what was happening in the MENA region in as far as investment in human capital. Again, to reiterate here, in the 80s and 90s, the government began a policy of macroeconomic balance at the request of the IMF and the World Bank, and which simply meant a reduction in government spending. So when we talk about reduction in government spending, that means that across the board, reduction in government spending across the board, which means that education and health will obviously be affected in this case. And that's exactly what happened during the late 80s and 90s. So human development pretty much slowed down and in some cases even declined. And also, when it comes to the government finding it extremely difficult to find funds, um, simply because of the huge deficits that these countries were incurring during the early 70s as a result of the ISI strategy. They really put the brakes on, and this obviously affected the poor tremendously, since now the poor saw complete elimination of a lot of the subsidies that happen to go basically to the poor. And in fact, in the MENA region, most of the subsidies, they don't go to the poor, they go to everyone. Because when we're talking about subsidies here, what are we talking about? When we talk about subsidies in the MENA region, the government is giving out subsidies. Does anyone have any idea here? What are we talking about when we say governments in the MENA region are giving subsidies?
Are we talking about like the food stamps that they could use to go to the markets, water, electricity, the housing, any basics of living?
Very good, yeah. In fact, when we talk about food stamps, the way it works in the MENA region, it really doesn't work based on your income, how much you're making. Each family has what we call a family booklet. Okay? In other words, you have the husband, the wife, and the kids, all included in that booklet. We call that a family booklet. So each family has a book, a family book, basically. Well, with all the information, the age, and so on, everything is contained in that family booklet. Now, all what you need to do is simply take that family booklet to a government warehouse that sells food. It's like a supermarket, giant supermarket. They're called um, government warehouses, basically. And you can go there and buy anything that you want at a very, very reduced price. Why? Because all those prices are being subsidized by the government. So in fact, you can buy cooking oil, you can buy tomato paste, you can buy pasta, you can buy rice. I mean, all types of food you will find in those mega stores, basically, at very, very reduced prices. So you don't have to be a poor person to be able to gain access. Even rich people can go there and buy. And they are entitled. Why? Because they have that family booklet. So all what you need is just take that family booklet there to them to show that you're basically a citizen of that country. That's what that booklet really means. In other words, if you're not a citizen, you won't be able to get that booklet. So as long as you are a citizen, then you are entitled. Now, if you are a foreign worker, unfortunately, you're not entitled. So if you're a foreign worker, you have to go to the regular supermarkets and buy your food from. But if you are a citizen, it doesn't matter whether you're poor or rich, educated or uneducated. It has nothing to do with it. You're simply a citizen of that country. You take your booklet, go to that market, buy whatever you want at a very reduced price. So that's one. Number two, when it comes to filling your car with gas. Now, in this case, of course, you don't need to have that booklet. Anyone can go there and buy gas at a very, very reduced, subsidized price. Right now, for example, I'm familiar with Libya, of course. A gallon of gas in Libya right now sells for about 30 cents, 1 gallon. That's how much you pay. So probably with $5, you can fill up your car with gas. And you don't have to be a Libyan citizen to be able to take advantage of that. Anyone who goes through a gas station can fill up at that price. Same thing with electricity. Now, you don't have to be a Libyan citizen here to take advantage of the reduced rates. Now, in Libya, for example, no one pays for electricity. It's as simple as that. No one pays. It's free. It used to be that, you really have to pay for electricity, but and a very, very, very small amount of money, by the way. It wasn't really that expensive. But later on, people just refused to pay for it. And the reason why they refused to pay for it, because there was a lot of outage. They would probably get electricity for maybe 2-3 hours. And a lot of people got mad. They said, okay, you're cutting electricity 2-3 hours. I'm not going to pay you anything. And, the electric company tried to cut off service to some of them, but those people were actually able to put the service back on. Again, corruption. And this really, takes us back to the rule of law. It's like a jungle, basically. I mean, there are no rules, no laws. Everyone does whatever they want, basically. And this is a huge problem. You don't have a strong central government, no rules, no regulations, free for all. And this causes huge economic, social, and political problems. But this is, I'm just giving you an example here of what the governments really have to put up with. So it's not always the fault of the government. The people must shed a lot of responsibility because of their bad actions. And here I'm not trying to protect the governments from any ill doings. No, absolutely not. The government also has its own share. But to be fair, everyone must hold some of the responsibilities here. But this is just to give you a picture of what goes on in some of the countries in the MENA region, especially those countries that are defined as failed states. In other words, there is no state capacity, no type of governance whatsoever. So we tend to define them as failed states, and Libya is one of them. It's a failed state, so it's free for all. I mean, you can do whatever you want, and there is no fear of going to jail or paying fines or all of that. You don't have to worry about. So it's a sad situation. And as a result, in a lot of the MENA region, you have a deterioration of public services simply because of corruption, because of the rollback of the state, um, because of the reforms that were imposed on some of these countries by the IMF and the World Bank. So all of this basically has led to deterioration of public services. And then we have a lot of these economic reforms that were undertaken by the MENA region, in fact, happened to benefit a very small sector of the population. What do we call that small sector? What do we call that elite? Anyone? Crony capitalists. So that's basically what those economic reforms that were implemented by the MENA region at the advice of the global institutions such as the WTO, the World Bank, and the IMF happened to favor a very small segment of the society, which is basically elitist in nature. And, we tend to refer to them as the crony capitalists, basically. And this is something that, the MENA region has to look deep into and try to find solutions. In other words, this is a huge challenge that must be addressed. And I was very, very much concerned here that whenever these policies are implemented, and they were implemented at the recommendation of the World Bank and the IMF, how come the World Bank and the IMF did not have any policy that could be implemented to make sure that these challenges do not arise, to make sure that these crony capitalists will not take advantage, and to make sure that there are penalties for those who try to take advantage of these policies unfairly. And as a result, there is a lot of blame that goes around And again, these policies that are implemented have to be well planned. They have to be evaluated on a continuous basis, and changes must be made whenever possible. But unfortunately, once these policies are implemented in a lot of these countries, there is no evaluation process. In other words, there is no sort of control mechanism to try and see if these policies are working or not. Once a policy is implemented, that's it. It's gone. It will continue. And this is a problem. This is a huge challenge. So this is another thing that you probably need to keep in mind. And, like we said before, the MENA is pretty much relatively poor in natural resources with the exception of oil, and the development of human resources as a result happen to lie at the center stage of many of these development plans. Basically, this is what we see happening in the MENA region. Now, also, access to public health and education in the MENA region is basically the main avenue that would allow the poor to escape the poverty trap. So this is basically what a lot of people in the MENA region strive for, education, because that's their way out of the doldrums. That's their way out of poverty, basically. And unfortunately, the access to public health and education is not very well implemented, basically. You will see that a lot of people, especially as we will see later on when we talk about health and education in more detail, in rural areas, a lot of people get deprived of the proper, good, quality education and health services. So when we talk about education and health, not all segments of society have access to it. It still remains very inaccessible to many in the MENA region. And this is a huge problem because it does dwarf, if you will, the opportunity for people to actually get out of the poverty trap. Now, let's go back to health. And we said that health is very important, but we really need to know how are we going to be measuring health here. And if you remember, we said that the indicators of health conditions are basically two. At least this is what we're going to be using. One of them is the life expectancy at birth, which is LEB, L-E-B, life expectancy at birth. And the other one is IMR, infant mortality rate. IMR, the infant mortality rate. So we can actually evaluate, or we can actually measure health conditions based on these two factors, LEB and IMR. And this is something that obviously we will talk about in much more detail here, because it's something that will help us determine how countries in the MENA region are doing in as far as their health conditions are concerned. And obviously, as I said before, good health is basically a multidimensional phenomenon. And it's extremely difficult to measure. However, we will use these two assessments that I just talked about, two assessments as indicators of good health conditions. Now, there are obviously wider health problems that we really need to be aware of, besides the LEB and the IMR, which are very well defined, very clearly defined, and it's a lot easier to measure. But there are a lot of other wider health problems that we also must focus on. And this really has to do with malnutrition, polluted water, poor infant feeding practices. And also, something that it's a much wider, broader concept here is the underdevelopment of a lot of these public health facilities. That's also another huge challenge. So we know that high infant mortality happens to foster high fertility and rapid population growth, which really adds to the headache of a lot of the countries in the MENA region. So when you have high infant mortality rates, this high infant mortality rates will happen to foster or to promote, if you will, high fertility rates, which would obviously going to lead to rapid population growth. So it's very, very important for governments, really, especially the policy makers, to have a good understanding of the causes and also the remedies for high infant mortality rates, because this is extremely critical. You got to know what is causing high infant mortality rate, and you got to be able to address it and find remedies for it, because ultimately this is what would help these countries control population growth, which is very important because high population growth really puts a lot of pressure on these governments in as far as expenditure is concerned, and in as far as finding jobs is concerned, etc., etc. So, this is something that has to be pretty much focused on. Now, if you look at the GCC countries, for example, and these are the rich oil producing countries, they have spent billions of dollars on healthcare. However, obesity has pretty much reached, I would say, near epidemic proportions in the GCC countries. Obesity is very dangerous for a lot of these countries' development trajectories, by the way. And the reason is simply because it takes a lot of money to address this problem in terms of healthcare. So, this obesity has pretty much increased the prevalence of chronic diseases in the GCC countries. And it drove up healthcare costs exorbitantly high. So this is another problem that these countries need to pretty much address. A huge challenge. How do you take care of this? Now, what will reduce infant mortality? Now remember, we said that infant mortality is the main cause for increased fertility and, in other words, high fertility rates and rapid population growth. So, what do you think should be done in order to reduce infant mortality? According to your book, of course, he looks at the three F's: family spacing, food supplements, and female education. These are the three F's. So again, family spacing, food supplements, female education. Now, the family spacing here, of course, what we mean by family spacing is simply the time between births. So the longer the time is between births, the stronger the mother is, and the more able the mother is to take care of its kids, basically. But if the spacing between births is so small or short, in other words, this would simply weaken the mother, and it may cause a lot of problems and issues. So in order to take care of that, you want to make sure that mothers are convinced that the best way to address this problem is through family spacing, giving enough time between births. Now, usually in the MENA region, the family spacing was probably a year or 16 months at the most. But now, in the 1990s and the 2000s, it has increased to about 3.5 years, which is pretty good. I mean, I try to increase it as much as possible, of course, but there are other arguments that, women and family members would present to say, no, they really don't want to have that huge gap between siblings. They really want to have as a smaller gap as possible so that they can grow up together. And this would also mean that, the mother doesn't have to worry about giving birth to kids after a certain age. Because if you keep the gap between them so long, then, the mother would continue to be producing kids even at a later age. So let's say, for example, if the gap between births is, let's say, 8 years. And if the mother wants to have 3 kids, so obviously the mother is going to be spending 24 years of her time, basically, taking care of kids. And that's, a lot of mothers don't want to do that. So it's like, for example, they want to have kids now and get it over with. And, after 10 years, they don't have to worry about this thing anymore because they're going to put a stop to it. And, there are good arguments here and there, basically. But that's family spacing. Now, food supplements, of course, this would help in fighting malnutrition, which obviously reduces resistance to disease. So the more food supplements a mother can get through government help or whatever, there are certain programs that would tend to, afford mothers with all these different foods that they need for the babies, which obviously does wonders in terms of reducing resistance to disease. So malnutrition can be obviously addressed in that way through food supplements. And then, of course, you have female education. Female education, of course, the more educated the mother is, the more she's able to take care of herself, the more she's able to program the family spacing, if you will, in such a way that it would reduce infant mortality tremendously. So those are simply some of the things that mothers can do. And I guess I'm going to leave it right there, unless some of you have questions, because we are running out of time right now. Any questions?
Professor, are you going to upload a set of notes for chapters 5 through, I'm assuming, 10?
Very good question. Yes, I will start on writing those notes. I don't have them ready, by the way. I will write them down. And hopefully I will upload them, or I will post them for you. I don't know when exactly, but it's just too many things at the same time happening right now. But yes, I will try to post those notes. First, I have to put them together. That's the first thing I need to do, because I really don't have notes here. I'm just lecturing from what I know, but obviously I need to sit down and put my thoughts together and um, organize them in a similar manner like I did with chapters 1 through 4. Yeah, I will do that. Yeah, I will
Thank you.
hopefully post them as soon as possible. Any other questions? Okay, so I guess then I will see you on Tuesday, and hopefully by then I will have your midterm scores. Hopefully, if
Thank
everything
you.
was okay.
Have a good weekend.
Okay, you too. Take care now.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Professor.
Welcome. Okay, then I will see you on Tuesday. All of you have a nice weekend.